as we head toward the end of fall and into winter, it's time to start using some of what we've stored from the garden. Bountiful fall harvests of things like onions, potatoes, carrots, and beets, whether we grew them ourselves or managed to snag some from the local farmer's market, or maybe we got them in a CSA, can absolutely be stored up for long-term use. In fact, many of us count on these harvests or market scores to feed our families throughout the winter. But it can be very disheartening to go into your pantry or your basement to pull out sweet potatoes for a big family holiday meal, only to find that they've gone soft or moldy, or to pull the onions out and find half of it needs to be peeled away because the outside is mush or they've sprouted and the center is rotten. Or even worse, to have fruit flies in your kitchen and you cannot figure out for the life of you where they're coming from until you open up the potatoes you stored and find a brown puddle where your spuds used to be. Today on Just Grow Something, we're going to cover proper winter storage of fall harvested vegetables, and we'll talk about some of those fruits too. There are plenty of things that we can store with no special equipment or storage facility, just a cool, dark area may be all you need. But understanding the difference between what your potatoes want versus what your sweet potatoes want can make all the difference in the world when it comes to how long you can enjoy those goodies before planting again in the spring. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen. I started gardening in a small corner of my suburban backyard, and now 18 years later, I've got a degree in horticulture and operate a 40-acre market farm. I believe there is power in food and that everyone should know how to grow at least a little bit of their own. On this podcast, I share evidence-based techniques to help you plant, grow, harvest, and store all your family's favorites. Consider me your friend in the garden. So, grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. So, ugly holiday sweaters are in the merch shop. There are 2 designs, and they are just ugly enough to qualify as an ugly sweater, but not so over the top that you can't wear them around town, like unironically. They're sweatshirts, actually. There is a Let It Grow design, and there is a Garden Elf design. They are available now to be shipped for all your ugly sweater parties, and of course, there are plenty of other designs and items in there to order for all the gardeners on your gift list this season, even if you're the only gardener on your gift list this season. Along that same vein, I am working on a gift guide with all the deals and discounts that you might find for gardening gear for holiday shopping this year. I will send an email when I've got that put together, hopefully by next week. So those of you who like to get all your shopping done on Black Friday and Cyber Monday can take advantage of whatever I can find. But I will also continue to update that as we go through the season because I get industry emails all the time highlighting products and discounts. So why shouldn't you have those too? If you're not on the email list, head to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com and there's a link at the bottom of every page to get signed up. And I will also put a link to that in the episode show notes. And one more note and an ask for you or from you before we start. A few of these episodes recently have gotten a little long, pushing like the 45-minute to an hour mark, where I usually try to stick to around 30 minutes. Sometimes there is a lot of information to share on a topic, and I may tend to get a bit carried away, and this is where I need your input. Is it too much? Like, do you prefer these episodes to be short and sweet and just the basics? Or do you like it when I deep dive into a topic? And if I do deep dive, would you prefer if it was split into 2 shorter episodes or leave it all as one, even if it's an hour long? I want to know how you best consume this content and how it's most beneficial for you, because I could talk about all of this stuff for like hours. Okay, so if you're on Spotify, I will do a poll in the episode notes. So look for that like in your player below. But everyone else, you can feel free to respond to this morning's email or DM me or leave a comment if you're on YouTube or however you can reach me. I'm making the plans for next season already, and I would love some feedback from you to make this show work better for you. So storing fall harvests properly can extend the shelf life of our veggies and our fruits well into winter, giving you access to fresh produce long after the garden season ends. Each crop has specific requirements for temperature, humidity, and storage containers. And there are a bunch of different storage solutions that will work even without a traditional root cellar or a basement. So let's break down the best practices, first for storing our veggies, and then we'll move into common fruits. And then we'll talk about alternative storage spaces if you don't have a basement or a root cellar, or if you are dealing with small spaces. If we start with the vegetables, in general, vegetables are best stored in a cool, dark, and well-ventilated area. This slows down the respiration and decay. You should start by sorting and inspecting your harvest or whatever you've gotten from the farmer's market very thoroughly before you decide to store it. We want to make sure that we are removing any damaged or bruised items that might spoil the one next to it, okay? And then we want to place them in as close to their ideal storage conditions as you can. So I'm going to give you those ideal storage conditions for each crop, and then we can kind of talk about how we can modify our space to match that. The idea here when we're doing storage at home is to do the best we can, okay? So we'll start with the coldest conditions, and then we will work our way to the warmest. The first is carrots and beets, and their ideal conditions are to be stored at temperatures between 32 and 40 Fahrenheit, or 0 and 4 Celsius, with humidity at 90 to 95%, and in either moist sand or sawdust or in perforated plastic bags. So the big thing with carrots and beets is if you are getting them from the farmer's market or you're getting them directly from your garden, you want to make sure that you trim those greens down to about an inch above the root to prevent moisture loss. If you leave those tops on, they are just going to continue to pull the moisture out of those roots, and they're going to start to shrivel, and they're going to do this very, very quickly. So anytime you're bringing them in, even if you're not storing them long term, even once you bring them in from the garden, you want to make sure you're taking those tops off. Then for long-term storage, you want to place the roots in either boxes that are layered with slightly moist sand or sawdust or some sort of a container. You want to avoid soaking the sand or the sawdust. It should just be damp to the touch. It shouldn't be like dripping wet, okay? If you are going to store these in an area that actually has high humidity, like, in a refrigerator drawer or something, then perforated plastic bags or mesh bags are going to work just fine. What we want is that high humidity. So that's the whole purpose behind the moist sand or the sawdust. It's going to keep the moisture and the humidity around those roots. But if you don't have a ton to store, or if you have a separate refrigerator that is being used for storing, then putting them into the refrigerator is fine. That's actually the ideal conditions, specifically if you put them into a crisper drawer, or if you put them into, like I said, those perforated plastic bags and put them in the fridge. If you have an unheated garage or a crawl space, that can work as like a root cellar alternative if the temperature stays above freezing. So you just want to put those containers up like on a high shelf or something, or in some sort of an insulated box to make sure that they don't freeze if you are living in a much colder area. The next up is onions. The ideal condition for onions is just slightly warmer than these root vegetables, and that would be between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Or we also want 60 to 70% humidity. So this means storing them maybe in mesh bags or breathable baskets. That humidity level is decidedly different from our carrots and our beets, right? 60 to 70%. This is still likely to be a higher humidity than most homes have. I mean, unless you live in a very, very humid area, and in which case you probably also live in a very warm area. And if your house is staying warmer than 32 to 45 degrees, then, in the house or in the kitchen is probably not the ideal place to store your onions. We do want to put them someplace where it is nice and cool. If you don't have a root cellar, we're talking a well-ventilated garage space or a very, very cool pantry, a basement. These are all fine. One of the things to realize, though, is especially if you have grown these onions yourself, if you intend on storing them, they need to be cured before you put them in storage. So curing them in a warm, dry well-ventilated area, and something that is about 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 to 3 weeks is ideal. And you want to make sure those outer skins are nice and papery and they have tightened up around that onion and the necks are very, very dry. Then they're okay to put into storage. If you have gotten these onions from a farmer's market, ask the farmer if you can when you're buying them whether or not they've been cured, but don't assume that they have been. So if you have these sitting around now, you may want to try to cure them before putting them away for any longer storage, okay? You also do not want to store them near potatoes. So onions and potatoes cause each other to spoil faster. Okay, one's giving off ethylene gas, the other is producing moisture. It's just not a good combination. So always make sure that you're storing them separately. If you are only have a few to store, you can hang your onions in a mesh bag and just put them on a hook in like a cool closet, or put them in a wire basket in a very dark cupboard. You likely will go through them, faster than if you have a very large number to store. But just know that if you're not keeping them at that nice cold temperature, 32 to 45, then they're not going to store for as long. Now, you can store them in the refrigerator, but I do not recommend putting them in the crisper drawer because that actually increases the humidity a bit too much. But for short term, like extension of storage, so say you go to your storage where you have got your onions and maybe some of them are starting to sprout or some of them are starting to get soft on the outside, but you're not quite ready to use them all yet, you can grab those ones that seem like they're kind of going over and put them in the fridge, and that's going to extend their life for several weeks. Next up is potatoes. These like their temperature to be slightly warmer than the onions. We're looking at 38 to 45 degrees, so we don't want them close to that freezing temperature. Definitely higher humidity, like 85 to 90% humidity. So keeping them in a burlap bag or a paper bag, cardboard boxes, this is going to kind of help to keep that humidity in there. This is another one that you're going to want to cure. You want freshly harvested potatoes to be cured. You want to keep them in a dark area at about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit for about 1 to 2 weeks. This is going to help to thicken that skin. It's going to help to extend the storage life. Once they've been cured, then you can go ahead and store them in a dark place, away from the onions, please. And avoid plastic bags, okay? That plastic is going to trap moisture in a way that we don't want. Yes, we want the humidity, but we also don't want it to actually be wet. And if you have them in a plastic bag, you actually can see the condensation in the inside. That is just going to promote rot. I don't know why they sell potatoes in plastic bags. You shouldn't store them in those. You want some sort of a breathable container. So again, a root cellar, a basement corner, a cool garage, something that's not going to get to freezing temperature. If you're just going to store them in a closet because you only have a few, keep them in a paper bag or that's open on the end, or a mesh bag to allow airflow. If you're going to put them in the fridge, again, put them in an open paper bag. And this is something that you would want to put in the crisper drawer because it likes that humidity, okay? The next one is winter squashes. So this is all of our winter squashes: acorn, butternut, spaghetti, kombucha, all of those. 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, so we are significantly warmer here now. 50 to 70% humidity. And generally speaking, you want to store them in single layers on shelves or in baskets or in wooden crates. If you have to stack them because you have a bunch of them, just try to be cognizant of the fact that where they are sitting on top of each other, you may end up with these sort of, I don't want to call them pressure sores, but pressure points where you might end up with some soft spots, okay? So if you can do them in a single layer, great. If you have to stack them, then sort of stack them opposite of each other so there's less area, surface area touching each other. This is another thing that should be cured before we store them. A lot of times we don't think about this with winter squashes, but it really does make a difference. And curing winter squashes is done at a much higher temperature. We're talking 80, 85 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 weeks, just to harden that skin up. But that is absolutely going to extend the shelf life. And do understand that there are some winter squashes that don't store as well or as long as others. So delicata squash, for instance, is considered a winter squash, but that skin is not that thick. In fact, it's edible. It was one of the reasons why it's like one of the only winter squashes my husband will actually eat. And so it doesn't store for as long. Acorn squash, usually only a couple of months before you start to see it start to get soft. Spaghetti squash, a little bit longer than the acorn squash, but maybe not quite as long. Butternut squash for sure, kombucha squash, all those other ones that have the really thick hard rinds, those ones you can hang on to for like 6 months, okay? Again, a cool corner of a kitchen, a basement, a pantry. If you don't have a root cellar, if you don't have any additional space anywhere, you can put them just on a shelf in your closet or in the pantry at room temperature. If you can't achieve that 50 to 55, just try to find the coolest shelf in your house or the coolest, closet and do the best you can. Finally, we have sweet potatoes. They like it the warmest, so 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. These make these good candidates to be stored in your kitchen if your kitchen doesn't get super hot. Humidity, 60 to 75%. That is ideal, but, it's not super necessary if it's lower than that. Anything higher than that, then you might have some problems, but most of us don't have 80% humidity in our kitchens during the winter time. So, if it's slightly drier than that, that's okay. Storing them in wooden crates or in cardboard boxes, preferably lined with newspaper. They tend to store better that way. Again, sweet potatoes need to be cured specifically before we store them, but also just before we eat them. Because remember that if you don't cure a sweet potato, you're getting nothing but starch. It's not turning those starches into that sweet sugar that we like to taste. So you want to cure them in a warm area around 80 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 weeks before you store them. Helps them develop that sort of thicker skin, also enhances their sweetness. But once they are cured, we want to avoid temperatures that are below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweet potatoes are prone to chilling injuries. So you will see them start to develop these pock marks along the outside, and those pock marks will eventually mold, and they just will not be any good at that point, or you'll be cutting bad spots off in order to be able to use them. So this is probably the best candidate for storing just in your kitchen, as long as your kitchen isn't getting too hot. If you use these techniques and you kind of pay attention to the temperature and humidity range, do the best that you can to get it as close as possible to those. This is going to extend the shelf life of your fall harvest well into winter so that you have a whole lot available to you out of your garden for months after the growing season has ended. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do this exactly for each and every one of these vegetables. If you do, power to you, because that's a whole lot of management between them. But the closer you can get, the better off you'll be, and the longer you will be able to store these veggies. Okay, so what about fruits? Right? Storing apples and pears and other fruits for winter is one of my favorite things because I am a big fruit eater. Yes, I love my veggies. Yes, I eat my veggies, but I crave fruits. But there are, again, specific conditions for each fruit type. So let's go over some storage guidelines for apples and pears and a few other fruit that are commonly preserved for winter, especially for gardeners who may not have access to a root cellar or a basement. And the first one is apples. We always store apples through the winter. Their ideal conditions between 32 and 40 Fahrenheit. So, right around that freezing mark, but the humidity is 90 to 95%. Okay, so very, very high humidity to keep those apples stored well. You want to keep them in cardboard boxes or some sort of a plastic bin with ventilation or even a breathable bag. So something that's either got some holes in it or even like a mesh bag of some sort or burlap. You want to make sure that when you're putting apples into storage, they are firm. They do not have any bruises. They don't have any blemishes, because a damaged apple is very quickly going to rot and it's going to start to affect all of the apples around it, okay? In terms of varieties, it matters which ones you decide to store. You want to choose late season firm varieties. So Fuji, Honeycrisp, Granny Smith, these are like my top 3 for storage. You don't want to store the early season apples for extended periods. They tend to spoil faster. So no Jonathans, no Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, none of those guys. My favorite to store long-term is Fuji. They do great throughout the entire winter in my storage area. I will still be eating crisp Fuji apples in February, and they will taste like they had just come off the tree. They are fantastic, okay? You can, if you really want to, wrap them individually in newspaper and that's going to kind of minimize the bruising and the pressure points. But generally speaking, if I have some that have kind of been huddled together for a while and they seem like they're getting a little bruised, I just use those for cooking instead of fresh eating. I'm not super particular about that, okay? Again, with a temperature like this, you're definitely trying to find, a cool basement or a garage if it doesn't freeze. Apples also store really, really well in the refrigerator. If you've only got a handful of them, or again, if you have a larger refrigerator that you're using to overwinter things in, a large amount of them can be stored. You can either put them in perforated plastic bags or just put them directly into crisper drawers to maintain that humidity. The one thing we want to be aware of is that we want to keep apples away from any other strong smelling vegetables because they will absorb the odors. So you don't want to be storing these in the same place really closely to like your onions, because the last thing you want is to be like eating an apple and having it like smell like onion. It's just, there's something off-putting about that, okay? Conversely to this, apples produce ethylene gas. So that is going to accelerate the ripening of nearby fruits and vegetables. So you really do want to store your apples kind of separate from anything else just to extend its freshness. Especially when we're talking about pears, which is our next one. You don't want to store your apples with your pears. Pears prefer their temperatures very close to what apples like, 30 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and again, 90 to 95% humidity. So they love the same conditions, and they can also be stored in paper bags or small boxes or whatever. But the difference with pears is that when pears are harvested, they are picked before they are fully ripe, or at least they should be. Pears ripen off the tree. If you have a pear that has been fully ripened on the tree, it is likely pretty much rotten by the time you try to eat it. Okay. And so fully ripe pears will spoil very quickly in storage. So when you harvest the pears or when you get them from your farmer's market, you're trying to get the least ripe pears that you can for your long-term storage. So you can either put them in storage or you can put them in the refrigerator or whatever and store them in that cold storage unripe. And then when you are ready to eat them, you can move them to room temperature just a few days before you want to eat them. And that's going to allow them to ripen fully. So if that's a problem, then think about why maybe we don't want to store our apples with our pears. It's that ethylene gas, right? So ethylene gas that the apples produce actually accelerates ripening, right, in fruits that are nearby. So if you store your apples with your pears are going to ripen more quickly in storage than you want them to, and you're not going to get them for a long-term storage, okay? So make sure they are separate from each other. And like apples, pears also emit ethylene gas, so you don't want to store them with other vegetables or fruits that you don't want to rapidly ripen either. So it's like all these little things have to have their own little area. And an insulated garage or a cool pantry can work if those temperatures stay stable and they stay cold and they don't drop below freezing. And in that instance, you might have to put one in the garage and put one in the other cool pantry if you're storing both apples and pears. Just keep them away from each other. The next one that can be stored is grapes. And the difference with grapes is they have a very kind of small window of temperatures that they prefer for long-term storage, 30 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? So again, very similar to the low end of what our apples and pears like, and also 90 to 95% humidity. All of our fruits really like that humidity. With grapes, you want to store them in shallow containers, just kind of loosely covered. You absolutely want to handle them gently when you are trying to prep them for storage, and store them on the stem if possible, because this can actually extend their shelf life. We don't want them bruised, so just avoid stacking them on top of each other. If you can kind of zhuzh them out into a single layer or just put them in a very shallow container just to prevent them from crushing each other, that is going to help. And then you just want to cover it really lightly with a cloth or a paper towel. This kind of allows some airflow, which is going to prevent mold. Again, that humidity, 90 to 95%, that might attract some mold. If you have a refrigerator for storage, I absolutely recommend that if you're going to store grapes, that's the best place to put it. A crisper drawer, again, or a shallow bowl with some really good ventilation in it, just put into the refrigerator if you keep your refrigerator very, very cold. We do ours. Ours is generally right at that 32 degree mark. But I do know some people don't keep their refrigerators that cold. Some of you are closer to like a 40-degree Fahrenheit, in which case you probably are not going to be storing grapes for an extended period of time. You can freeze them if you're choosing to use them just for jams or jellies or something, or juice. But if you want them for fresh eating, then they need to be at about that 32-ish degree mark in order to be able to use them. So maybe not something that is an option for everybody, but if you've got the ability to do it, I absolutely recommend it. Again, I'm all about the fresh fruit. And then finally, winter citrus. So oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruit, these things that are harvested sort of in the winter time. The ideal storage temperature for these guys is between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 85 to 90% humidity, typically in mesh bags of some sort or in kind of a ventilated crate. Once again, citrus fruits should be stored on their own. That high acidity and that moisture can lead to mold if it's kept with other produce. And this is another one that you really should store in a single layer in a ventilated container or very loosely in mesh bags. We don't want them jammed together because you're going to end up with bruising and flat spots and that sort of thing. This temperature, the 40 to 50 degree storage temperature, makes it a little bit easier to find a good place in your house to store these. So if you don't have a root cellar, a cool pantry, a closet, they generally are going to last longer than some of your other fruits at a closer to room temperature environment. If you don't have that, then, in a refrigerator is fine. The crisper drawer is good because you're going to help with that humidity unless you have an older refrigerator that has a bottom freezer, and that tends to cause that crisper drawer to get colder than the rest of the refrigerator. Like in mine, I mean, the thing is like 15, 16 years old, I think. And sometimes I will put lettuce in my crisper drawer, and when I bring it back out, I have frozen lettuce because for some reason the temperature has decided to change even though nothing else has. And it's just because it's an old refrigerator. So you know what you're working with, right? If your crisper drawer tends to stay colder, then maybe not put your citrus in there. So we can absolutely preserve things for weeks or even months, depending on how we do it. If you don't have a root cellar or an area that is designed to store some of these things, some of your options include a garage or a crawl space even, assuming that your crawl space is accessible and it's clean. You're not dealing with rodents. We don't want that. But if you are in a cooler climate, a garage or a crawl space can actually act as sort of a pseudo cellar during the winter. So you can insulate it with straw. You can use blankets if you need to protect things, and then use bins to be able to store things. If you don't have a basement or you don't have a garage that's available, you can also use balcony storage boxes or deck storage boxes, right? So if you live in an apartment and you want to do some of this type of storage, or if you just don't have any place suitable, a storage box that you would normally use for like storing your couch cushions, your outdoor furniture cushions, these can provide extra storage space for your hardier stuff like your carrots and your beets, depending on how cold it is outside. If you need to, you can insulate the box with straw or blankets and keep it outside all winter if you are in a cold area. If you're in an area like mine where right now the temperatures can fluctuate dramatically, you would need to wait until your temperatures tend to stay closer to ideal, but it's something to consider if you don't have another space. Another thing to consider would be using an insulated cooler. These can maintain a stable temperature and they will work for like the root vegetables and things like potatoes. So if you have a garage that maybe doesn't stay quite as cool as you want it, or maybe it gets too cool, either one, if you use a cooler, then they will help insulate the temperatures a little bit and kind of alleviate some of that fluctuation back and forth. And then finally, a mini fridge. If you can dedicate a little dorm-sized refrigerator somewhere in your house that's just to your vegetables or just to your fruits that you want to maintain for long term, You can adjust the temperature and the humidity in that little mini fridge, and it becomes a great little storage area for some additional, like, long-term storage of your produce. So get creative, and maybe the next time you come across a really good deal at the farmer's market, or you have a bounty that you are pulling out of your garden, you will be able to figure out how to store it more long-term so you can keep eating on those fruits and veggies for the entire winter. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.